In the pre-dawn hours of Thursday, June 24th, the Champlain Towers South condo building in Surfside, Florida, suddenly collapsed. Structural deficiencies caused part of that 12-story building to crumble instantly into a massive pile of debris. And as of today, the death toll stands at 64, with 76 vacationing men, women, and children still unaccounted for and presumed dead. Where was God when that tragedy took place? You know, as we reflect back on instances of personal and national tragedy, many people are left wondering and questioning, where was God when those things happened? When that condo building collapsed and all those people died, why didn't God stop that unnecessary suffering? Why did God allow my young child to be diagnosed with cancer? Why did God allow my loved one to be taken from me tragically and suddenly? This is often used as an argument against God. Skeptics and atheists say, if your God really is all-loving and all-powerful and just like you claim, why doesn't He intervene? Why doesn't He put an end to this sickness and pain? Either He doesn't really exist, or worse, maybe He's some kind of sadist and He enjoys the suffering of others. And that's why He allows it to continue. You know, this is a question that even believers struggle with. And if you're a believer and you struggle with this question, don't feel surprised, because, you know, Gideon had a similar question in his mind. Gideon, the great hero of the Bible, in Judges 6, verse 13, when an angel assured Gideon that God was with him, his response was, if God is with us, then why have all these bad things happened to us? And where are all His miracles, which our fathers told us about? You know, that's a legitimate question. Why do these bad things happen to us? And we're going to explore that question this afternoon. And I think we're going to see that the best and really the only answer to pain and suffering isn't in modern medical marvels or radical social policies, but it's in the ancient Creator. And we're going to see God's presence within the pain and the suffering. As always, before we keep going, let's take a moment right now to go to God in prayer. This issue of pain and suffering is quite an old argument. In fact, it was first propagated by the Greek philosopher Epicurus. He said, if there is a God who wishes to prevent evil but cannot, He is not all-powerful and thus not God. If He has the power to prevent evil but will not, He is not good and thus not God. If there is a God that has both power and the desire to eliminate evil, then why is evil and suffering present in the world today? Epicurus saw an incompatibility with God's nature, with His all-loving nature, His all-good nature, and His all-powerful nature. And many people feel the same way as Epicurus and present his argument as one that invalidates the idea of God. And on this basis, many people shun God. You know, they say, we've tried religion, but religion doesn't work. It doesn't solve the problem of pain and suffering. But I want you to see that in order to understand this issue of pain and suffering, we have to go to the Bible for the answer. Because not only does the Bible bring closure to the problem, it is the reason that we discover there's a problem in the first place. The Bible is what alerts us to the fact that there is any problem at all, and that the world is not supposed to be this way. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you ask any other belief system of faith to explain the problem of evil, you're going to find that their answers are less than satisfying. The atheist answer to evil is that suffering is the product of a chaotic, uncaring universe. There's no rhyme, there's no reason to the suffering. That's just the way it is, and that's how it's always been, and that's how it's always going to be. Now you see here, suffering is not an argument in favor of atheism. Atheists still experience pain. Pain and suffering doesn't go away if you're an atheist. And so their answer really doesn't solve the problem. In fact, in my opinion, it makes it worse, because now there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just the luck of the draw, whether you suffer or not, the product of an uncaring universe. Buddhism says that suffering is not real. The material world is just an illusion. And so the pain that you experience is also an illusion. And so suffering is a distraction that you just need to learn to ignore. There are more important things to pay attention to than pain, so do your best to just ignore it. Hinduism teaches that suffering is karma. It's a debt that has been incurred based on past bad behavior. And so if you're suffering, it must be because you did something to deserve it, either in this life or perhaps in a previous one. Islam teaches a fatalist view. That is, if you are suffering, it must be because God fated it to happen. Nothing can happen without God's permission, and therefore He must desire for you to be suffering, if that's what you're experiencing. Now, I don't know about you, but none of those answers appeal to me. None of them are very comforting whatsoever. And in fact, Christianity is the only system of faith that confirms our intrinsic feeling that pain and suffering is wrong and that the world was not meant to be this way. You see, the Bible informs us that it was never God's desire for there to be evil in the world. The world that we know that is racked with pain and sorrow and anguish wasn't meant to be like that. And it wasn't always like that. In Genesis chapter 1, the first book of the Bible, we find the record of the creation, the beginning of the world. And when you read through Genesis chapter 1, you notice that after each act of creation is completed, God pronounces it very good. And then you get to verse 31 at the conclusion of creation. It says, "Then God saw everything that He had made, and indeed it was very good." And so the Bible informs us that the world, as God created it, was free of evil. It was free of pain. It was declared to be good. Furthermore, we find out that mankind occupies a unique place as the overseers of God's creation. In Genesis 1, verse 26, we read, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.'" And to this end, God endowed mankind with something very special, very unique in the scope of creation, the characteristic of free will. God gave mankind the ability and the freedom to act according to His own wants and desires. God wouldn't control how people acted or how they would speak or what things they would choose to do. He would allow mankind to choose for himself. And in this way, mankind had a resemblance of the creative power that God has. Now in Genesis chapter 2, we learn that God made a special home for mankind, the Garden of Eden. And life in the garden was a paradise. There was no want for food or shelter. There was a tree called the tree of life, which grew there. And those who had access to the tree of life experienced immortality as long as they ate of its fruit. This was a place where man could live in direct communion with God. What a great blessing. And then after all these preparations were complete, God placed man in the garden. And the garden was meant to be his home. It was supposed to cater to his every need and to fulfill his every desire, to be the perfect place for him to live. Now, God also put a tree, another tree in this garden, called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the purpose of this tree was to give mankind free will. You see, through this tree being present in the garden, mankind was given the choice either to serve God or to disobey Him. As Genesis 2 verses 16 and 17 says, God gave this commandment to man, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Through this tree, God was giving mankind free will and teaching mankind a lesson about good and evil. Have you ever thought about that? In abstaining from eating of the tree, mankind had knowledge of sin in the same way that God has knowledge of sin. They had, you might say, a theoretical knowledge of sin. God taught them about sin, but they hadn't experienced it. Only through eating of the tree would they learn of sin circumstantially. And this is what went wrong. This is what caused paradise to be lost. Because you see, mankind succumbed to that ageless lie of the devil. When the devil said of God's instructions, "You shall not surely die." And Adam and Eve ignored God's warning and they ate from that tree. And in doing so, they showed through their choice that they didn't believe what God had said. They didn't believe that God really had their best interests at heart in giving those instructions. And in doing so, they brought a terrible curse upon humanity, the curse of sin. And we read in Genesis 3, verses 16 through 19, that sin is the origin of every form of suffering and pain in the world. Just listen to this. To the woman he said, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Then to Adam he said, "Because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and you have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, 'You shall not eat of it,' cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return." Through sin, every form of suffering that we experience entered into the world. Chief among them, death. No longer was mankind going to be immortal, but they would suffer and die. The body would decay and they would return to dust. Also through sin came plagues and sickness, natural disasters, every form of immorality and evil you can think of, from broken homes to abuse to addiction. All of these things proceeded from sin. These were the natural consequences of Adam and Eve's free choice to disobey God. Now, we might stop right here and ask the question, why didn't God put a stop to the pain and suffering right then and there? If He really loved Adam and Eve, if He really loved us, why is He letting us experience pain? If He has the power to create a place like the world free of evil at first, or create a place like heaven that we're assured will always be free of evil, why couldn't He remove it from the world? Friends, this question is not as simple as it first seems. First of all, consider men and women are created in the image of God. That is, God endowed them with the ability to act freely and to choose. And this is an expression of God's love. His permission, the freedom that He gives to humanity is an expression of His love for us. But with freedom of choice comes the heavy responsibility of consequences. Can you imagine a world where every consequence was the same? A world where one person who chose to make sacrifices, to take care of the poor, to do good, and then another person who chose to rob and to steal and to abuse and even to murder everyone that he met. Can you imagine a world where the consequences for both of those choices were exactly the same? What kind of world would that be? It would certainly be unjust and unfair. It would be unreasonable to expect such a world of God. No, there are consequences for a person's actions. Now, God's desire and His hope is that people will recognize that His way is best and that they will choose to freely follow His instructions. And in doing so, Jesus says in Matthew 5:16, when we choose of our own free will to perform good works and good deeds and to show compassion to mankind, this brings glory to our Father in heaven. But at the same time, He allows people to choose freely how they will act, even if it is in a way that is self-destructive and even outright rebellious to Him. And that is the unfortunate truth. Pain and suffering are natural consequences of choosing to sin. If you choose that path, God will not supernaturally rescue you from the consequences of those choices. Now, I think most people understand that. Most people realize that, if someone were to get drunk and to get behind the wheel of a car, and in the process of driving under the influence, crash into a telephone pole and get ejected from the car and be paralyzed for life, most people would recognize that was a fair consequence of such an action. But what about innocent people? What if that same drunk driver took the life of an innocent person, a child, a daughter, a sister, a mother, a grandmother, and that same drunk driver walked free with no injury, no consequence? What about that? Now, that's a difficult question to answer. You see, the guilt of sin is on the one who commits it. We understand that. But the consequences of sin often affect innocent people. Not just the participants, but innocent victims too. And we know that's true. We are still experiencing the effects of Adam and Eve's sin today. As Romans 5:12 says, through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin. And thus death spread to all men because all sinned. Why? Why is that the case? Friends, it's because God is not a respecter of persons. God treats all people equally. As Matthew 5:45 says, He makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the just and on the unjust. God's love is such that He does not discriminate. And His desire is to show love for each and every person, because each and every man and woman is created in the image of God. And this also includes the freedom to choose good or to choose evil. God does not withhold this freedom from certain people and then allows others freedom of choice, but everyone has free will. Sometimes choices bring about consequences that impact those around us, and we understand this. Is God unfair for allowing our free choices to affect others? Remember, we can affect others not just for the worse, but we could choose to affect them for the better as well. This is not unfair of God, because we have the ability to impact people for good too. Not only that, but God's desire is for those who don't have a relationship with Him to come to know Him. And to that end, He gives everybody time. He is long-suffering and patient, even though it grieves Him, because His hope is that people will turn from the ways of evil and repent. It's true, sometimes people suffer terribly and unjustly for the sins of other people. But that's not on God. The blame is on the sinner. Now, I want you to consider also, not all pain and suffering is the result of personal sin. One of the consequences of sin's curse on the world is that the world is now a dangerous place to live. Our bodies don't have the benefit of immortality as they did in the garden. We can experience injury and death. Now, there are natural laws that regulate the operation of the universe that also have the potential to harm us. The same chemical properties of water, which make it necessary to sustain life, can also cause somebody to drown. The same properties of sunlight, which warm the earth and bring forth food, can also cause people to get skin cancer. In order to protect us from these dangers, our bodies now have a sense of pain, which alerts us to the danger. And the unfortunate reality of pain is that it's painful, it hurts, and it can cause quite a bit of misery in and of itself. But is this unfair? I submit to you, this is not unfair. God has designed a universe that is regulated by natural laws. We can study and understand and harness these laws for our own benefit, and we can avoid danger. What's the alternative? A world without consistent physical laws that don't stay the same? Can you imagine if somebody fell out of a tree, and every time that happened, God changed the law of gravity to prevent that person from getting injured and experiencing pain? How would you live in such a world? It would be chaos. In fact, such a world would point more towards atheism than to an organized, intelligent designer. We can't blame God for creating a world regulated by consistent laws that could potentially injure us if we choose to ignore them. Friends, we could go on and on with these theoretical questions, but the reality is the corrupting influence of sin has caused evil to become a pervasive part of the world. Evil is a struggle that you can't escape from in this life. You know, it seems like there's nowhere on earth that hasn't been touched by the corruption of sin. And that is simply the current state of this world. You couldn't completely remove the influence of evil from the world without destroying it completely. As Romans 3:23 says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We all have at some point perpetuated evil by sinning. Friends, we'd be going out with the evil if God were to remove it from the world. We would have no hope. And so this question of why is it allowed to continue is really flawed. Ultimately, it's a vain question with no compelling answer. You know, you could spend your whole life wrestling with it. The entire book of Job, one of the longest in the Bible, is wrestling and reflecting with this on this problem. But even if such an answer were found, friend, it wouldn't change the reality of our situation. The truth is, the scriptural answer to why there is pain and evil is the truth, but it's emotionally unsatisfying. Friends, there's a better question for us to ask. Instead of asking, why does evil exist, we really need to focus on, what is God doing about it? You see, this is where the hope in Christianity lies. Because in the midst of Adam and Eve's despair over their mistake, there in the garden in Genesis 3:15, God didn't leave them without hope. But He promised that the seed of woman would overcome evil. That prophesied seed was Christ. Thank God, because God hasn't given up on man. He has reconciled His hatred of evil and His love for mankind and His desire for mankind to have free will through the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is, that deity incarnate came down from heaven, gave up His glory to share in poverty and in sickness, in suffering and abuse and in pain, and ultimately death, even though He didn't deserve it, so that we could be rescued from that state. Thank God that we have a God who is not afar off, but who shares in our sorrows and who cares about us. Sometimes people ask, how can you serve a God who would allow this to happen? But really, that's an ignorant question. The real question is, how can you not serve a God who's made the ultimate sacrifice to save us? And that's how I want to conclude this study with this final point. I want to look at a Christian response to suffering. How can we deal with the problem of pain and suffering in our individual lives? I want to encourage you, first of all, you need to make things right with God. You know, so many people accuse God of abandoning them, when in reality, they never had a relationship with Him in the first place. Isaiah 59 verse 2 says, "The Lord's hand is not shortened, that it cannot save, nor His ear heavy, that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have separated you from your God, and your sins have hidden His face from you, so that He will not hear." You see, Epicurus's idea about God is flawed. The problem doesn't lie in God's power, but in mankind's own stubbornness to continue living in sin. Friend, the only assurance that you can have that you're not experiencing suffering as a consequence of evil or sin in your life is to be a Christian, is to be living a godly life. The only assurance that you have that God isn't angry with you and that He is listening to your prayers is to be a Christian. The terrifying reality of those who live in sin is they have no expectation of help from God. So you need to make things right with God. There is no honor in suffering because of your own sin. As 1 Peter 4:15 says, "Let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters." Don't be suffering because of your own negligence or your own defiance against God. Second of all, you need to reframe your perspective about suffering. The Christian perspective provides the only satisfying answer to suffering, because if we're living righteously, we have that assurance that we're not suffering because of our own sin. And yet, why do we still experience pain and suffering? Sometimes it's because of righteous living. You know, Matthew 10:24 says, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master." The fact is, Jesus, the only person to live sinlessly, the only truly righteous person in the world, he experienced suffering. And it's because often righteous living invites persecution from jealous people who don't want to be convicted in their conscience against the way that they choose to live apart from God. And so they try to get righteous people to stop living that way. They did that to Jesus, and we can expect the same if we're following after Him. How can we be comforted in the face of such persecution? 1 Peter 4:16 says, "If anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter." You can have the assurance that if you're living righteously, you are being unjustly persecuted. If you're experiencing suffering for righteous living, and that the people who are persecuting you, if they don't change, will have to face the consequences for that. You can also have the assurance that Jesus is there with you in the midst of the suffering. In Acts 9, verse 4, maybe you remember Saul was there on the Damascus road. Saul, the persecutor of Christians, and Jesus said to him, "Why are you persecuting me?" The persecution Saul was carrying out against Christians, Jesus viewed as persecution against him. And he sympathized with those followers who made such sacrifices and experienced such difficulties in order to stand up for the faith. We're going to have to reframe our perspective on persecution, because it's something you can expect and anticipate living as a Christian. I want to give you some verses to keep in mind. Romans 8:28 is great. "All things work together for good to those who love God." You have the assurance that if you are living righteously and working towards good, God is not going to leave you hanging, but He is faithful and just to lift you up. Matthew 16:25 says, "Whoever loses his life for Jesus' sake will find it." Even if righteous living causes you to lose your own life, you can have the assurance you have laid up spiritual treasure in heaven. Recognize persecution and suffering as an opportunity for growth. As Romans 5:3 says, "We also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance." Oftentimes, these periods of suffering are when righteous character is fully developed and begins to show forth. You know, we call a region that gets nothing but sunshine a desert. It takes periods of rainstorm to produce fertile soil. Maybe you remember in the parable of the sower how these different plants were sown, and the same sun that beat down on all of them caused some to wither and others to produce fruit, 30, 60, and 100-fold. And the difference was that those producing plants were rooted deeply in the soil. Persecution and suffering is the time to become more fully rooted in your faith. You know, it's easy to live righteously when everything's going perfect for you. That's the accusation that Satan brought against Job. Satan said the only reason Job serves God is because God is bribing him to do it. We need to have the attitude that Job had in the midst of his suffering. He said, "We served God in the good times. How can we abandon Him during the bad?" Embrace times of trial as a time to run to God and to draw closer to Him. As the psalmist wrote in Psalm 119, verse 67, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word." Third, we need to show mercy to those who are suffering. This is what Jesus taught us through His life example. Most of the suffering that people experience is senseless. It has no rhyme or reason or meaning to it, but it's brought on by the state of an evil world. What did Jesus do in such cases when He encountered people who were suffering? I think about John 11, when Jesus' friend Lazarus died. And He went there, and what did He do? He sympathized with the mourners, and He empathized with them. He wept with them, and He shared in their sorrow. I think too of John chapter 9 with that blind man. Remember, sitting by the side of the road, and the disciples asked Jesus, "Rabbi, why was this man born blind? Was it because he sinned, or was it because his parents sinned?" And Jesus said, "You've got it all wrong. It was neither of those. It was so the works of God should be revealed in him." Jesus didn't jump to judgment about what happened to cause people to suffer or what circumstances might have led to it. That's because not all suffering is from personal sin. And so we should do the same. We should not cast judgment, but we should use the suffering we see in others' lives as an opportunity to minister to them and to show them the love and the mercy and the grace of Christ. James 1:27 says, "Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world." Show mercy to people who are in need. Do everything you can to be known for the trait of Christian benevolence. Certainly, don't be a part of the problem of suffering in the world. If you are found to be a cause of suffering and pain in the world, you're going to have to answer to God for that come Judgment Day. Finally, we need to respond to suffering by anticipating home. You know, our purpose in this life is not to be comfortable or even to have easy lives, but it's to get ready for eternal life. Are you feeling weighed down by the evil and the suffering that is present in the world? Does it cause you despair? Friend, you're not alone. Romans 8, verses 18 through 22 says, "For I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of Him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs until now." Friend, if you are in despair over the state of the world, that's a good thing, because you recognize there's a problem. You shouldn't feel at home in this world. You should be like the creation, eagerly looking ahead, looking forward to the time when it's burned up and remade into the New Jerusalem. When you feel despair in the midst of suffering, fill that with a longing for home. Look forward to that time when we will experience the resurrection body. No more pain, no more suffering. Death will be an enemy destroyed, laying slain at the feet of Jesus. Keep your eyes on home and don't get too comfortable in this world. Friends, where is God in the dark? God's in the same place that He's always been and that He always will be, reigning on His throne, shining the light of Jesus Christ forth. Jesus is the light of the world. In Luke chapter 1, there's a wonderful prophecy about Jesus and what He would do for people. And I want to read Luke 1, verses 78 and 79. It says, Jesus is the dawn of hope. He gives light to those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. Friends, in the midst of a troubled old world, the message of Jesus Christ is what people need to hear. The kingdom is advancing, conquering the forces of darkness. Let's do our part to shine forth this hope into the world, to let people know that life isn't meaningless. There is hope of life after death because Jesus has overcome sin through the resurrection.